Hi, I'm James Verdier, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences Bioscience Talks, which is a forum for integrating the life sciences. For today's episode, I'm joined by Jesse Nippert, professor in biology at Kansas State University, and Chris Helzer, who's director of science and stewardship for the Nature Conservancy in Nebraska. They were here to discuss their recent bioscience article, Rethinking Grassland Management in the Great Plains During the Era of Woody Encroachment, to which you will, of course, find a link in the show notes. It was a fantastic conversation, and so with no further ado, let's go to the interview. All right, thank you both very much for joining me today.
Good to be here.
Yeah, good to be here.
Okay, so I guess for a first question, it might be useful to introduce the general type of landscape that we're going to be talking about today. So can you tell me something about North American grasslands, how were they formed, when, and just a little bit of the history of, that sort of ecosystem?
Yeah, the Great Plains grasslands are the second largest grassland ecoregion in the world after the Serengeti. And these grasslands are fairly young in their modern iteration, having assembled after the end of the Pleistocene glaciation. So as the glaciers retreated, grasses and grassy systems that were further south, like Texas, Mexico, Central America, started to migrate northward following the glaciers as they receded. And then over this last 8 to 10,000 years or so, as humans inhabited this continent and became in higher abundance, they started to use fire to manipulate where bison were moving on the landscape and for a variety of other reasons. And in doing so, the use of fire with some frequency strengthens the competitive ability of the grasses, which then leads to a larger grassland area in this region of the continent.
Okay, and I guess one quick follow-on question. How does fire favor a grassland ecosystem?
Sure. Fire promotes grasses and grasses promote fire. So as grasses cure, they're highly flammable. And unlike a tree, they hold their meristems or their growing points just below ground. And so when a fire comes through and removes all of that dead biomass from the previous year, it then opens up the soil surface to warm quickly. And as the soil surface warms, it promotes the growth of new buds to develop into leaves and to quickly sort of produce new vegetation on the landscape. So typically for us here in Kansas and Nebraska, after you run a fire through in April, May, March, it's not uncommon to have a green surface replace that black surface within 10 days. So you can go from a completely black charred landscape to one that looks like the Ireland in terms of how bright green it is, 10 days later. And that's the interplay of fire and grasses.
And I do think it's important. I mean, what Jesse's just said about fire and humans, it relates to the paper that we're going to talk about too, but you can't separate people from prairies in this modern, last 8 to 10,000 years. And that's a really important starting point because a lot of times when I talk to people about not just woody encroachment, but other topics, you almost have to start there and make sure we're on the same page. It gets into interesting topics like what's natural mean? Because if you think, natural is without people, then we have to sort of back up and get on the same page before we can move forward.
Yeah, so we're really talking about an ecosystem that's, one that's adapted to and in some senses formed by, human intervention from many, many thousands of years ago.
Yep.
And I've got to ask one just quick off-topic question. Why would you use fire to manipulate the movements of bison? Or how would one do that?
That's a great question. Go ahead, Chris.
There's a long history of large grazers responding to fire, and part of it's the response to fire. Usually, it's really a response to the kind of growth that happens after a fire by the vegetation. After a fire sweeps through, those herbaceous plants are putting on new growth. It's the most nutritious, high protein, digestible growth that they have. And so and there's nothing in the way, right? All the old dead stuff is out of the way. So every bite, you get a nice clean bite of everything that you want as a grazer. And so a fire is a really great attractor to those large animals. And then once they've been grazing that, even after the fire effects have sort of diminished, they're still attracted to the same area because now they're grazing the regrowth of plants that they grazed because they were burned. And it can kind of perpetuate this cycle of grazers going wherever the most recent fire on the landscape was.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for indulging that question. I was just personally curious, and I thought I'd go ahead and ask. So let's leap forward, or perhaps not that far forward, and talk about kind of what's happened to this landscape more recently, and that can be kind of anywhere, sort of post colonization by Europeans or whatever makes the most sense for talking about it.
Yeah, sure. So, in the mid to late 1800s, of course, as immigrants were coming into this country and they were looking to make new lives for themselves, the agricultural breadbasket of America formed here in the Great Plains. And the reason for that is just because these soils, because they were recently glaciated, are very fertile soils for agriculture. And so all of the corn and the wheat and the beans and everything that fuel basically our food production system here in the United States began, and they came at the expense of our tall grass and our mixed grass prairies here in the Great Plains. And so that was the first main loss. And then over the last 20 to 30 years here in the Great Plains, we started to see a phenomenon that they were seeing in the desert Southwest nearly 70, 80 years ago, where woody species were replacing grassy species on the landscape. This process is often called woody encroachment or woody thickening or bush encroachment. And it gets at this idea that some native woody species are expanded rapidly in our modern world. And as they do so, they displace the grasses. And as they displace the grasses, there's a whole cascade of changes to the ecosystem that follow.
And it's related to fire, right? I mean, the as the landscape changed from grassland to row crops, for example, and became more fragmented, we lost the people who were doing the fire. The next set of people in were less prone to use fire. They were more afraid of fire in a lot of places. And the landscape didn't carry the sort of large scale fires that it used to because it was broken up into pieces and there wasn't a continuous fuel source for that fire to burn across. And so that also impacted woody plants.
Right. So we have this sort of scenario of, increasing woody encroachment, largely resulting from, the fact that the fire regime has changed. What else is going on, that's affecting, this landscape, whether that be climate change or whatever else?
Well, the climate change impacts kind of depends on what aspect that you're referring to. You can think about changes in carbon dioxide concentration, rainfall timing and amount, changes in temperature. And some of these things reinforce the dynamics of the grasslands, and some of them are contributing to these shifts from one state to another. So, for instance, one of the big ones is elevated CO2. And as carbon dioxide goes up in our atmosphere, it favors the woody plants over these warm season grasses that they're replacing based on photosynthetic pathway. Woody plants use the C3 photosynthetic pathway, and with an increase in CO2, they can grow faster in a shorter period of time, and then they can become less vulnerable to fire as they sort of escape and get to an escape height where they can basically start to change the intensity of the fire that they experience by shading out the grasses that live beneath them.
Right. And I think it's probably, obvious to me, and I would imagine most of our listeners, who would appreciate the intrinsic value of this ecosystem. But what sort of ecosystem services do humans derive from grasslands like this one as it's historically existed?
Boy, there's a bunch. Starting with agricultural uses, right? I mean, most of these grasslands are owned by private landowners. The majority of the Great Plains is privately owned. There's not a lot of federal land or public land. And so the land has to kind of pay for itself in order to stay in grassland. If it doesn't, people are looking for other land uses. And so productivity matters mostly for livestock, either direct grazing or production of hay or some other crop that those grazers are using. And that provides food, right? So one of the services that humans get from grasslands is simply food production. But also, there's a whole range of other things from carbon sequestration and just productivity of soil underneath that grassland, the filtration of water. Grasslands along waterways make a huge difference in terms of keeping that water clean, even just replenishing the groundwater, capturing rainfall, letting it percolate through the soil, either into groundwater or out into streams through springs, things like that. Yeah, those are a few. Jesse, what am I missing?
Grasslands also are quite biodiverse. And so when you think about the plants, the endemic species that live there, as well as the species that have broad distributions, it's not uncommon to have hundreds of different plant species in a fairly small physical space that correspond with many, many insect species, vertebrate species, bird species, etc. So that tends to be a big one.
And do we sort of, in a sense, lose out on these types of benefits if we, allow unchecked woody encroachment into them?
I mean, that's sort of the big question right now, right? Is uh, I think that's been the assumption for a long time. That we've sort of defined grasslands as these places that don't have woody plants, and so if woody plants come in, we feel like we've lost something. Uh, Part of what we're trying to do with this paper is to get people to think a little bit more complexly about that. I guess is complexly a word?
I'll buy it.
And and you know, we need to figure out more. We need to learn more how to deal with grasslands that have a stronger woody component in it, and find out how much of those ecosystem services we can keep around with that woody encroachment. And a lot of that comes down to how we manage the encroachment, the height and the density of those shrubs, which is something that, at least in the northern half of the Great Plains, especially, we just don't have any experience with. But I don't think it's necessarily true. It isn't necessarily true that we lose biodiversity or productivity just because we add woody plants to the system.
Yeah, a key component of that is the density. So when you have woody plants in the system, but you still have an intact grassy layer that can support fire and harbor some of those inherent services that we just talked about, that's completely different than when it becomes a monocrop of whatever that woody species is. So if you think about like a field filled with eastern red cedar where they all touch and there's no understory whatsoever, that's a different outcome than when you think about that same field and it's interspersed with woody plants in different areas, but you still have an intact grassy layer.
And that's not to say there aren't fundamental changes, right? When you have enough shrubs in a landscape, you can see some really big changes in the animal communities. For example, you're going to get different bird species that are going to use that area. That there are birds that won't use habitat if there's enough woody cover in there, but there will be other birds that use that. Same thing with small mammals, with invertebrate communities. And one of the questions that we just don't have good answers for is, do we lose the diversity of species, or do we just see a change in the species that are going to be the most dominant or playing certain roles in the ecosystem? And I think there's a good chance that it's the latter, but we just still have a lot to learn about that.
Yeah, I'm curious, what types of interventions would one use if one were trying to, put a hard stop to woody encroachment? How do you manage a landscape if that's what you're trying to do? And I gather that that's the attempt that's been made at some points.
Depends on whether you're talking about now or 50 years ago, I think, because it's changed. Um, I mean, well, Jesse, you should talk about fire first because you have a lot more data on that fire in Kansas.
So the tools you use are kind of dependent upon the species, what woody species you're referring to. So one of the most widespread encroaching species or group of species in North America are the junipers. So eastern red cedar and then others that are related to it. Those species are not clonal and they don't sucker and they don't regrow. So if you burn them or you cut them, they don't come back. And so those types of treatments across a landscape tend to be effective. So areas that haven't had fire for decades or centuries, if you have the ability to re-implement fire and you slowly can kill them off, they're not going to come back if you can keep fire or cutting on the landscape. But one of the things that has become like more of a pernicious problem are these clonal shrubs. So these shrubs exist in high density and you can cut them, you can burn them, you can spray them with herbicide and they will often come back. And so they're just regrowing from a central below ground pool of meristem, similar to the way that the grasses are operating.
And to clarify what Jesse was saying, the cedars don't come back, but they except from seed, right? Like just in case any landowners are listening to thinking, wait a second, I burned and now I have more cedars again. They will come back in from seed, but they don't resprout, right? So those individual trees are dead, and that's a huge difference when we're thinking about land management. The problem is that we used to be able to burn at certain frequencies and feel confident that we can keep those woody plants from moving into an area. And that seems to be changing. We're not seeing the same effectiveness of the frequent fires that we used to see. And we think there's a lot of reasons for that, including atmospheric CO2 and a lot of other factors. The fact that there's more trees to create more trees. And so that's sort of one of the things we're talking about with this project is the old ways of doing things have changed, and they're not as effective as they used to be. And so we need to look for new ways. And those can include things like mowing, grazing to some extent, browsing by species like goats. There's a lot of other things we can throw into that equation with fire in many cases, and try to manage it in a more intensive way and with some more variations.
Right, and we're talking around right now this resist, accept, direct type of framework. I was hoping you could introduce that to us a little bit and tell us a little bit about the types of approach that you're advocating for in this article.
Yeah, sure. I'll give it a first pass and then Chris can add to it. So one of the things that we're sort of recommending for like land stewards and land managers and rangeland folks is when you are out on your landscape and you're evaluating it, kind of get a feel for where you're at. If you're in the heart of the Flint Hills here in east central Kansas, it's almost all exclusively still tallgrass prairie, intact tallgrass prairie. So in that situation, we are not advocating for you to let woody plants get established and make your peace with them. We're advocating for you to continue to keep out the woody plants and maintain that high intact functional grassland ecosystem. In other locations where you've got woody plants starting to come in, but they're still manageable, one of the things that we were advocating for is you can think about potentially trying to direct the system towards one that is a little bit more completely grass dominated, or trying to think about ways in which you are keeping it, again, with those high ecosystem services, keeping a grassy layer. And in areas that have become very, very encroached, starting to sort of think about like, what is our cost benefit ratio in terms of interventions that we can do that we'll probably never recover it back to what that original grassland would have looked like, but to a point where we are living with some of these woody species and still deriving a lot of valuable human services that are benefiting the individual as well as the broader community. So it's the first step is really sort of assessing the conditions you are for the location that you're at and thinking about what are the desirable outcomes that I want to achieve here.
And then being willing, I think, to adapt over time as conditions change, right? One decision may be the right one for now, but it also is helpful to think about, well, under what conditions would I change my mind on that approach? If you're in the Flint Hills now and you've got a lot of open space around you, there's not a lot of woody plants, it's pretty easy to keep it that way. Awesome, do that. But at some point down the road, if your neighbors on all sides of you have a lot of woody encroachment, it's going to be increasingly difficult for you to keep that out. And so you might need to switch from, one strategy to the next.
Okay. And then I guess, coming at this as someone who lives in an area that would naturally be sort of a salt marsh, and not knowing much about the land management of, grasslands at all, I'm wondering, how does this actually happen in a real way? How does this sort of advice become to be disseminated down to, I guess in most cases, the private landowners who are actually doing the administration of this land, and how do we actually see this stuff happening sort of in the real world?
That's what this podcast is going to accomplish, right? Everybody's going to listen to this and then they'll know.
I think we have an amazingly large population of landholders who are listening to us right now. But just in case any of them miss it, kind of how does that process generally work?
I mean, I think we have a really good network in the Great Plains of people who are doing, sort of academic research or real sort of on the ground data driven science. But we've also got a lot of people who are just experimental. Some of those are conservation groups, some of those are private landowners, some of those are other people, public land managers. So there's a lot that's being learned, and then the transfer of that information to the rest of the landowners or the land managers, I think, comes through a bunch of different channels. University extension is a really important one. There's a lot of state and federal agencies who have people on the ground working with landowners on habitat projects or just giving them advice on how to have productive farm and ranch operations. there are organizations like the Nature Conservancy as an example. We have land where we are constantly experimenting with different strategies and then hosting workshops and putting out information on everything we learn and transferring that sometimes directly to landowners, sometimes directly to those other people who work with landowners. So there's just a whole bunch of channels. And then one of the most effective ones is when you have a private landowner who finds out something that works, the neighbors find out about it because they can see the impact of it across the fence and they start to talk to each other. And then that diffusion of innovation, that spread of information can move pretty quickly if somebody finds a successful strategy.
And I'm wondering now about what sort of research we should be on the lookout for, or what are the interesting research questions, that are yet to be answered. And I think we've discussed a couple of them already, but just in sort of a forward-looking type of way, what do we not know now that it would be valuable to know, and what sorts of things should we be looking out for in the future?
Well, one thing right off the bat that I mentioned before, while we have effective control measures for cedars, we don't really have those for these clonal shrubs. So one of the things that we're really working on trying to get a better handle for is how do we effectively manage to control shrub spread or eradicate shrubs? And a lot of times that's going to come down to sort of thinking about how do we layer on disturbances in multiple fashion. Maybe you're going to run a fire through and try and knock back all of the living stems, and then a couple weeks or months later, you're going to put a browser or out there, like maybe goats or something like that, that helps knock them down. Like, how do we think about layering on disturbances in a control sort of way? Another thing that comes to mind is ranchers manage lands of all different sizes. And if you're running a small acreage, your strategies and how you manage that landscape are going to be different from the ranchers who are managing thousands of acres. And so getting a feel for scale and things that can work at scale in a cost-effective way is going to be a real challenge as we think about moving forward.
Yeah, I'll build on that by saying, mowing a patch of clonal shrubs twice in the same growing season, we think has a pretty substantial impact on, making that a lot less competitive, keeping the height and density lower for a couple of years at least, maybe 3 to 5 years in some cases. That's really helpful. But if you've got 10,000 acres on your ranch, you're not going to be mowing 10,000 acres or even a significant portion of that very often. But that's where, especially twice a season, but that's where if you run a fire through it, and that's one treatment, and then you can use cattle or goats or something like that to graze some of it. And maybe you do mow portions of it, in high priority areas to get that second treatment. I think there's a lot of potential, but we just don't have enough experience either as practitioners or as researchers to understand what the best approach is there. And then the other thing I would add to that is we still have a lot of questions, I think, about where these clonal shrubs are, how fast they're spreading, where are they spreading to, how do we anticipate which landowners need to be thinking about each of these different strategies and when, so that we can sort of help guide their approach as we move forward so they're not surprised by it. With Eastern Red Cedars, we got way behind. In Nebraska, for example, I think we still got a shot at keeping a lot of our grasslands free of that cedar encroachment, but we got way behind before we really started acting on it. And we want to try to prevent that with this second wave or this next wave of like the clonal shrubs. We want to have some strategies in place before it gets to the point where it's a real catastrophe or a real economic challenge.
With an increase in utilization of data that is being collected remotely, so whether it's satellite based or high flying airplanes or whatever, that you can use AI tools to really start to assess where these shrubs are on the landscape. Like before, you couldn't really pull out the grassy layer from the shrubby layers. And we're getting to the point where you can see it from this imagery and help to discern exactly where they're at using some of these tools. And that's really going to go a long way to capturing the problem or to containing the problem, especially on these big landscapes. Because then imagine you've got like drones can carry herbicide payloads, and you could mark exactly where those shrubs are and send a drone out to spray after a fire has went through or after your browsers went through. And then you're not dumping herbicide on the grassy communities and all the negative effects of just broadcast spraying. It's pinpoint accuracy using techniques like that. So there's a lot of tools that are developing that we're still sort of in the beginning stages that hopefully over time we can start to utilize to a greater extent.
Well, and Jesse talked about herbicides. We haven't really talked about those much, but obviously that is a strategy for controlling these species. And if you want to kill a clonal shrub, you almost have to use herbicide if you really want it to stay dead, because like Jesse said earlier, they resprout so easily. But if you cut it, for example, and paint a little herbicide on the stump, that'll kill it. The problem is we don't want to get to the point where people are using, or broadcasting herbicide across large areas where we're having a loss of biodiversity or a loss of productivity, and working against the objectives that we're trying to fix by controlling woody shrubs. And we definitely have seen that before in plenty of places, including the Great Plains. So we want to make sure that we have strategies to deal with this issue before it comes to the point where people feel it's out of control and their only option remaining is to just go out and broadcast herbicides over a large area. But pinpoint very selective application of herbicides is and can be a really effective way to either eradicate small populations or to limit the spread of larger populations, things like that. It's just obviously herbicides come with a lot of potential baggage. You got to be careful.
Yeah, it sounds like there's an emerging theme of getting ahead of the problem or the issue before it becomes one that gets tougher to manage.
And part of that is just raising awareness, right? It's such a, we saw the same thing with eastern red cedars in the northern plains, where it's such a slow progression that you don't really realize that it's happening until it's really late in the game. And with these clonal shrubs, I mean, they've been around forever. Most of these things that we're talking about are native species, right? They've been part of the system for a very long time, but they are starting to change the way they compete. They're starting to move faster in a lot of places. And so just getting people to be aware of that change and to look for, how it's affecting their own land is a really important part of what we're trying to do.
Yeah, great analogies, human health. You go talk to your doctor and he says, eat well, get exercise, lower your stress, all these preventative measures. And that's really the same thing that applies to these grassy ecosystems. Do what you can to be like preventative measures before it becomes very difficult to control.
Great. I think that's a fantastic note on which to leave the conversation. So thank you both. And thank you additionally for mentioning AI, drones, and native species, because it wouldn't be a Bioscience Talks podcast without those. And I'd been remiss in the first bit with not saying any of those things. So thank you very, very much for joining me. And we look forward to hearing more.
Thanks. It was
Thank
fun.
you, James.
And that concludes this episode of Bioscience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal Bioscience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences and is made possible by the support of our members and donors. Thank you, and talk to you next time.